What if the man who helped cheat more than 1,500 regular investors out of around $200 million ended up in a minimum security prison for less than 2 years, wrote a best-selling memoir, got a Hollywood blockbuster made about his life, and now travels the world as a motivational speaker? That's not a movie pitch, that's the real story of Jordan Belfort, the so-called Wolf of Wall Street. By the end of this video, you'll see exactly how he built an empire of lies, how it finally collapsed, why so many victims are still waiting for justice, and the uncomfortable truth Hollywood never told you. That the system around him just didn't fail to stop him, it created him. And along the way, I want you to ask yourself one question. If someone this obvious, this reckless, this public can still turn fraud into fame, what does that say about us as a society? Jordan Ross Belfort was born on July 9, 1962 in New York City to Jewish parents Maxwell and Leah Belfort, both accountants, and he grew up in Bayside, Queens. So no, he wasn't born into some billionaire dynasty. He was raised in a modest apartment in a working and middle-class neighborhood by two parents who literally counted other people's money for a living. But from early on, Belfort wasn't interested in balancing books. He wanted to explode them. The summer before college, he and a friend sold Italian ices on the beach at Jones Beach in New York, hustling from styrofoam coolers. They made about $20,000 in one summer. Now, pause and imagine that. You're 18, standing on a hot sand with a cooler and a scoop, and you finish the summer with more money in your pocket than many adults see in a year. That moment is important because it taught young Jordan something dangerous. If you have a good story and a strong pitch, small things can turn into big money very fast, and that lesson never left him. Belfort used that ice cream money to enroll at the University of Maryland School of Dentistry after graduating from American University with a degree in biology. On the very first day, the dean reportedly told the incoming students something like, "The golden age of dentistry is over. If you're here to get rich, you're in the wrong place." For most people, that will just be a sobering reality check. For Belfort, it was a hard, pivotal moment. He dropped out and almost immediately, not because he didn't want to work, but because he didn't want to work for that kind of money. He wasn't chasing a profession. He was chasing a number. In his 20s, Belfort launched a door-to-door meat and seafood business. Think about that for a second. Not Wall Street, not hedge funds. He was literally knocking on strangers' doors selling them bulk meat from a truck. According to multiple accounts, the business grew fast but chaotically. He was moving thousands of pounds of meat a week, but the company eventually went bust and filed for bankruptcy. Late deliveries, spoiled product, overextended credit, it collapsed under its own weight. But here's the key. Belfort didn't walk away from that failure thinking, "I'm a bad businessman." He walked away thinking, "I'm great at selling." The product had been meat. Back then, it could have just as easily been vacuum cleaners, magazine subscriptions, or used cars. What he discovered was that if he could get someone on the phone or at the door, he could talk them from "I'm not interested" to "Where do I sign up?" This mindset, the product doesn't matter, only the pitch does, would become the engine for everything he did next. In 1987, a family connection helped Belfort get a trainee job as a stockbroker at L.F. Rothschild, a respected Wall Street firm. This was his first real step into legitimate finance. Real suits, real terminal, real million-dollar trades. There, he learned how professional brokers used urgency, authority, and complex financial language to move massive amounts of money with just a phone call. But then came Black Monday, the global stock market crash on October 19, 1987 that wiped out trillions in market value and hit Wall Street firms hard. L.F. Rothschild was one of the casualties. Belfort, just a trainee, was laid off in the aftermath. For most people, that's a dead end. You lose your first big break, you dust off your resume, you look for another stable firm. But Belfort didn't do that. He looked at Wall Street collapsing and asked a very different question. Where is there even less regulation and even more commission? The answer he found was penny stocks. Penny stocks are low priced, often thinly traded shares, usually not listed on major stock exchanges, but sold over the counter. At the time, brokers working in that world would earn huge commissions far higher than on blue chip stocks. Some operations offered commissions around 50% on trades compared to typical single digits. Imagine calling someone and making as much as half of whatever you persuade them to put in. Belfort quickly realized something simple and dark. The smaller and more obscure the company, the easier it was to tell any story you wanted about it. You didn't need solid fundamentals, you just needed a convincing pitch and a list of phone numbers. This environment, thin regulation, high commissions, low transparency, was the perfect petri dish for what would become his signature crime, the pump and dump. In 1989, Belfort founded Stratton Oakmont with Danny Perush. On paper, it was a brokerage firm, but in practice, regulators and later analysts described it as a boiler room, a high-pressure sales operation pushing often worthless securities on unsuspecting investors. At its peak, Stratton Oakmont employed more than 1,000 brokers and was involved in stock issues totaling about $1 billion, including helping to underwrite the IPO of Steve Madden, the footwear company. The business model was brutally simple. Buy a huge amount of shares in a small company, often through nominees or shell accounts. Have an army of brokers aggressively calling thousands of investors using scripts and psychological pressure to push the stock. As demand and price spike, dump the firm's own shares at the top. When the price inevitably crashes, the firm and insiders walk away with millions. The investors are left with next to nothing. That is the textbook definition of a pump and dump scheme. Now imagine you are on the other side of the phone. You're a teacher, a retiree, a shop owner. You get a call from a confident young broker. This company is about to explode. We are giving out our best clients first access. If you wait, you'll miss. You don't know the same call, almost word for word, is being made to hundreds of people that day. You don't know the price you're paying has been engineered in a closed little ecosystem of hype and internal trading. You just hear certainty. You hear the promise of a better life and you say yes. Inside Stratton Oakmont, the culture was legendary for its excess. Reports from former employees, court documents, and Belfort's own memoir describe heavy drug use, especially cocaine and other substances, fueling a continuous cycle of risk and recklessness. The office was frequently described as more like a fraternity than a professional workplace, with wild parties, sex workers, and stunts that had nothing to do with finance and everything to do with dominance and ego. Here's why that matters. That environment wasn't just random chaos. It was part of the machine. If you keep everyone amped up on adrenaline, money, and altered state, you make it easier for them to ignore doubts and ethics and consequences. And it worked. Stratton Oakmont became one of the most notorious firms in the American penny stock world, drawing the attention of regulators who called it one of the worst actors in the industry. By the end of the 1990s, Belfort was rich, extremely rich. He spent millions on cars, mansions, drugs, and a 167-foot yacht originally built for fashion designer Coco Chanel, which he renamed Nadine. In 1996, while sailing off the coast of Italy near Sardinia, Belfort insisted on taking the yacht out during rough weather. The vessel encountered severe storms in the Mediterranean and ultimately sank. Those on board, including Belfort and others, were rescued by the Italian Navy. It sounds like a scene written for a movie. A drug-fueled stockbroker ignoring warnings, plowing into a storm, nearly dying as a luxury symbol of excess disappears beneath the waves. But that happened, and it foreshadowed what was coming next. The NASD, now FINRA, subjected the firm to continuous scrutiny, eventually expelling it from the industry in 1996, effectively shutting it down. But the real endgame was led by law enforcement. FBI Special Agent Gregory Coleman, specialized in financial crimes and money laundering, eventually led the investigation into Belfort's activities, focusing on stock manipulation and the movement of illicit funds through offshore accounts and shell companies. Investigators pieced together phone records and brokerage tapes, trading patterns showing coordinated price spikes and crashes, offshore transfers designed to hide proceeds, testimony from insiders who decided to cooperate. Court filings and later reportings indicate that Belfort himself estimated that investors lost up to $200 million due to the schemes connected to Stratton Oakmont. More than 1,500 clients were identified as victims, many of them small investors putting in their savings, not institutional giants. Imagine being one of them. You're not rich, you're not playing games, you just want something safer than a lottery ticket and better than a savings account. And then one day you discover the firm that talked you into that trade doesn't exist anymore. The stock you own is virtually worthless. The man at the top is negotiating his plea deal while you are trying to figure out how to retire. In 1999, Belfort was indicted for securities fraud and money laundering alongside his partner Danny Perush. He ultimately pleaded guilty, admitting to running pump and dump schemes that caused investors losses of around $200 million. In July 2003, he was sentenced to 4 years in a federal prison and ordered to pay $110 million in restitution to roughly 1,500 victims. He ended up serving 22 months at a minimum security facility in Taft, California, being released in 2006. So let's pause on that. Around $200 million in investor losses, over 1,500 victims, a 4-year sentence of which less than 2 years were actually served. Compare that to how long it takes most of those victims to recover their savings if they ever do. As part of this plea deal, Belfort cooperated with the authorities, wore a wire, and testified against former colleagues and partners to secure reduced sentences for himself. In other words, the man at the top didn't just profit the most, he also got one of the lightest outcomes. While in prison, Belfort shared a cell with comedian Tommy Chong, who later recounted encouraging him to write down his story. After his release, Belfort wrote The Wolf of Wall Street, published in 2007, followed by a sequel, Catching the Wolf of Wall Street. He received a substantial advance and later sold film rights. Reports put film-related payments in the 7-figure range. In 2013, director Martin Scorsese and actor Leonardo DiCaprio turned that memoir into the film The Wolf of Wall Street, a global box office success that cemented Belfort's public image as a charismatic, almost cartoonishly excessive anti-hero. After prison, Belfort reinvented himself as a motivational speaker, a corporate sales trainer, and author teaching straight-line selling techniques. Meanwhile, in 2018, news reports indicated he had paid somewhere around 12 to 13 million of the $110 million he owed in restitution, leaving tens of millions still unpaid and more than $90 million outstanding. So think about that. He turned his crimes into content, he turned his stories into a brand. And to this day, many of the people he harmed have received only a fraction of what the court said he owed. It's easy to watch the movie, laugh at the outrageous scenes, quote the lines, and treat Belfort like a larger-than-life character. But behind those scenes are real individuals. Around 1,500 investors identified as victims, total losses estimated around $200 million. These weren't hedge funds or Fortune 500 CEOs. They were teachers trying to stretch a pension, small business owners looking for ways to grow savings, retirees hoping their nest egg would last. For some, the losses meant working years longer than planned, selling homes, delayed or completely lost retirements. And unlike Belfort, they didn't get book deals, they didn't get a movie adaptation, they didn't get speaking tours. They got silence. So here's the part that makes this story feel less like history and more like a mirror. Belfort's story isn't just about one man's greed, but about a culture that rewards confidence over honesty, glorifies extreme wealth no matter how it's made, treats financial crime as entertainment as long as it's packaged with enough charisma. Regulators did eventually shut down Stratton Oakmont. The courts did eventually convict Belfort and order restitution, but the fact that someone can help oversee a fraud that costs investors roughly $200 million, serve only 22 months in a low security prison, pay back only a fraction of what's owed, then rebuild a lucrative personal brand on the back of that story, says something unsettling about where we place our attention, our sympathy, and our outrage. Because as long as we cheer louder for the wolf than we listen to the sheep he devoured, the system that produced him will never really change. And maybe that's the scariest part. Not that Jordan Belfort existed, but that in the right conditions, in a culture that worships money, speed, and spectacle, there will always be another one waiting for their turn. And if we're not careful, the next call that comes promising the opportunity of the lifetime might be ringing your phone.